Hi guys, I thought I'd do another short video on yoga and veganism, and really just to talk about how I feel that the two are really interconnected and go hand in hand. Yoga is practiced by so many people. It's become such a common thing in the West. Veganism is also becoming more and more common. Figures seem to show that there are a lot more people practicing yoga than there are those practicing veganism, and when I found out about those figures, I thought, right, I'm going to find out what's going on here, because in my mind, the two are so intimately connected. I mean, let's just talk about yoga to begin with. I mean, yoga as a word comes from a Sanskrit word, and it basically means to connect, to come together, to have unity. One could say it's to have unity of your mind, body, and soul, or unity and connectedness to you and everything else around you. Within yoga, there's a number of sort of scriptures or writings that give the yoga teacher something to follow. So when I did my yoga teacher training, we followed the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and Patanjali was I suppose you could call him the godfather of yoga. He didn't invent yoga, but he wrote 8 steps to freedom or liberation. And if these 8 steps are practiced, then one is closer to finding liberation, freedom, happiness, peace. So I'll talk you through these 8 steps and how I think that they actually really link to veganism, because, I mean, ultimately veganism means doing no harm as far as is practicable to any other being, not causing any suffering as far as practicable to any other being. So these Yoga Sutras of Patanjali have these 8 limbs, and I'll briefly go through all the 8 limbs with you, but I want to focus on the first limb really. So the first limb is yama, which basically, I suppose, are sort of ideals that we've all been taught. Things like don't lie, don't steal, be grateful for what you have. Then you've got niyama, which are sort of rules and laws. So things like attitudes, keeping your mind clean, not having sort of hatred for other people because it's toxic. Then you have the third limb, which is asana. Asanas, this is the limb that most of us are most familiar with in the West, especially. It's the physical practice of yoga. It's the practice of the postures. Then the fourth limb is pranayama, which is the breath and the importance of breath control. Then you've got the fifth limb, which is pratyahara, which encourages one to sort of draw back and retreat. Stimulation, it's a withdrawal of senses. Then you have dharana, which is the concentration of mind, which in essence increases awareness. Then you have dhyana, which is meditation, that's the 7th limb. And then you have the 8th limb, which is samadhi, which I suppose it means union with the divine, or maybe what the Buddha meant when he talked about enlightenment. By practicing those 7 steps that I've just mentioned, one can then be closer to reaching samadhi, which is, I suppose, the ultimate aim, the ultimate goal, full oneness and union. I want to concentrate more on the first limb, which was yama, which I mentioned, about the ideals that we've all grown up with and how they intrinsically link to veganism. The connection there is so uncanny, in my opinion. Yama is divided into 5 sublimbs. So the first one is ahimsa, and some of you may have heard of ahimsa, which is basically a principle that talks about non-violence and no harm. If we link that to the animal agriculture industry, whether it be the meat or dairy industries, animals are confined, they're enslaved, degraded, they're exploited, and ultimately they're slaughtered once they've been used or bred. If that doesn't contradict ahimsa and its ultimate meaning, what does? I mean, ahimsa talks about not harming oneself and not harming others. Surely that extends to all beings. Then the second sublimb is satya, which is truth. And when I read about and I was taught about satya, I began to think about the meat and dairy industries and how much we're lied to. I mean, you only have to put the television on and, adverts with a cow grazing happily in a field and her calf beside her. That's a full lie. How often do we see that? And if we do see that, do we know that that particular calf will be separated soon? Do we know that that cow will be attached to a machine to be milked for hours a day? We see the Happy Egg Company and they advertise happy hens. again, could be further from the truth. What a lie. These hens are put in small cages, tight cages, where they urinate and defecate on each other. The resulting ammonia causes them lung disease. They get all sorts of diseases because they've been manipulated to produce 300 eggs a year. Isn't that a lie? And yet, yoga, if one is practicing it, is teaching us to be truthful. And yet, if we consume these things, are we not consuming a lie? Then the third sublimb is asteya, which is non-stealing, not taking what isn't yours, and not sort of stealing something from another being. If we're drinking the milk of a cow, surely that's stealing something that isn't ours. If we're wearing the wool that comes from a sheep, surely that's stealing. If we're wearing silk or down or even leather, the skin of another being, that's stealing. I mean, we're ripping away a calf from a cow so we can steal her milk. We're stealing that calf's milk. And yet this principle of asteya teaches us not to steal. How can we practice asteya ourselves through the practice of yoga if we're stealing something that doesn't belong to us? Then you've got the fourth sublimb, which is brahmacharya, not to sexually exploit. So perhaps it means for some not to be promiscuous, or if you are going to engage in sexual acts, then to ensure that both parties are consenting. I mean, that sounds very reasonable, but if we're trying to implement brahmacharya into our lives and yet we are consuming milk that comes from sexual exploitation, we're consuming cheese that comes from sexual exploitation, we're consuming eggs that comes from sexual exploitation, surely that's a contradiction. I mean, a dairy cow is artificially inseminated. You can see my video on the realities of the egg and dairy industry to learn more about this process. She's artificially inseminated by an arm of a farmer that goes up her rectum. That's sexual exploitation all over. And that's done so that she could be made pregnant, simply so she can produce milk, so that she can bear calf, so that that calf is taken away from her, so that her milk can be sold to supermarkets. Doesn't all of that contradict this basic principle of yamma? Then you've got the fifth sublimb, which is aparigraha, living within moderation, only taking what you need and not taking in excess. 7 billion people living on this earth. We're slaughtering approximately 67 billion animals a year. We're using land resources as if there's no tomorrow. Deforestation is happening by the second. Carbon emissions are on the rise. The air is being polluted. The ozone layer is getting more and more holes in it. And this is all because we're consuming a product that relies on the earth's resources to this extent. The amount of water that's used, the amount of grain that's used to feed livestock, to feed animals, and then those same animals are then used to feed humans. Countries in the third world are selling their grain to the West, so the West can feed that grain to livestock, and yet that grain could be used to feed themselves. If that doesn't contradict aparigraha, what does? So when it comes to veganism and the practice of yoga, for me, because of these principles and how closely they relate to our own practice, what we consume, the choices we make, the two go so hand in hand. I mean, imagine if we were basically living a life where we didn't participate in the killing of other animals. If we lived a life where we were making more compassionate choices, we'd be so much more conscious of the foods we eat and the clothes that we wear. It reminds me of a quote that Gandhi once said, which was the most powerful weapon on this earth is the table fork. My teacher once in India said to me that the first part of yoga is diet. If we can't combine what we eat to our practice of yoga, then there just seems to be a huge misalignment there. So yoga and veganism, for those reasons, are so intimately connected. If you want to learn more, watch my video on the realities of the dairy industry. Please don't feel that I'm saying that you can only practice yoga if you're a vegan. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that if one is to really practice these principles of yoga to their truest and purest sense, then in my opinion, one has to be vegan. It's the most basic thing that we can do to be compassionate to ourselves and to be compassionate to all beings. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel, Imperfectly Vegan, and follow me on Twitter.